Hi, everyone. Hey, welcome to our Sex and Resistant event on Why Feminism. Thank you all so much for being here today. We're really excited to dive into our speakers' personal stories with feminism, and we hope that you take away a deeper and a more intimate understanding of why feminism is so important and why it affects everybody. Our three speakers today are Dr. Pilcher, Dr. Godwin, and Dr. Hom, all of which are involved with the Georgia College Women's Center and who have collaborated with us to create this event. And so, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and invite Maddie to introduce our first speaker.
Okay, so our first panelist, Dr. Pilcher, is a member of the Department of English. They received their PhD in Film and Media Studies from the University of Florida. I personally had Dr. Pilcher for my GC1Y last year, which was called Gender in American Cinema. In that course, we looked over new and old films, readings, photographs, and assessed different representations of gender. Their class was really informative and compelling, and they shared a lot of valuable ideas that I connect this year in my GC2Y and just throughout life. So, Dr. Pilcher, thank you for being here with us, and take it away.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for your introduction, Patty. And thank y'all for having me today. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Let's see, I think y'all have to enable it for me before I do that. All right, here we go. Thanks. All right, get my slides pulled up over here. All right. One sec, sorry. Taking a little time here. All right, here we go. So why feminism? That's y'all's wording. I'm borrowing it here. I want to talk to y'all just for a few minutes today, kind of about my personal background and journey with feminism, and then some of the questions and things that are important to me when I'm thinking about feminism and what it means, yeah, just personally. So my background and my journey. Growing up, I did not have that much experience with feminism, really talking about it, discussing it, kind of coming from a background where it was seen in sort of a negative light and just something that people didn't talk about in any kind of real depth. So that's kind of led to what has been an evolution for me of coming to understand gender and what it means and the importance of gender and how it affects the world around us, how it affects my own life with that as well. So my evolution is a blend of my personal experience with gender and intellectual growth. So what's going on in my life, what has been important to me, over the span of my life, and also the things that I've learned and read about and the stuff beyond me that I've been able to to gain more knowledge of. So just a little bit of some the high points of that. Growing up, definitely in terms of gender, was huge tomboy and definitely into sports. And I think early on, and then as I got older, I ran cross country and track in college as well. I definitely came to understand that there were gender expectations. And for me, as I navigated being that sort of tomboy in those sports worlds and just expectations of what boys, girls, men, and women do, and a lot of contradictions within that as well. So that's a lot to sort of work through and to also make sense of yourself, your own ability, body, and that kind of thing. So that's something that I still, that sort of arena of sports as well, something I still have sort of passion for as well. Something that affects my life. The other aspect of that is my career path, my film and media studies background, my love for movies. I threw a couple of movies on here that from sort of earlier on in my life, Mean Girls and this kids film, The Little Giants, which I loved as a kid. So obviously watching movies teaches you a lot about how gender works as well. And that's something that interested me from early on and something that I now study, and gender is a huge part of my research and looking at movies, a range of movies, old and contemporary, and in my classes as well, something that we talk about. So the other piece of that, just my journey, that evolution of how I came to understand gender, would be coming out coming out as not straight and coming out as non-binary and genderqueer as well. So all those experiences sort of come together to, as a transition slides here, really what I think I have evolved and what I figured out over time is that gender really does matter. It matters and it affects my life. It affects how society around us operates. And there are these multiple ways in my life that I began to see that. And over time, realizing that it is political. There are larger forces at play there, from norms and expectations in society. It's always going to be political, whether we want it to be or not. And taking a back seat and kind of ignoring it and being just like, that's the way it is no longer a viable position for me. And that activism is a crucial part of that because it matters and because there's still inequality that exists. So this last bit here, like how my perceptions change, what are the big questions for me? I think as gender matters has become part of my identity. I think I realized personally gaining knowledge, reading stuff, all of that has made me realize that feminism is really nuanced. It's complex. It's difficult. It is not perfect. If you're looking back just the trajectory of it, even just in the United States. It's also intersectional. It intersects with other aspects of our identities and in complex ways that are at times difficult to make sense of. So I think questions, keeping an open mind, rethinking things, being fluid, being adaptable, not thinking that your one perspective is the only feminist perspective. All that's crucial if we're thinking about, what we should do, how we should sort of think about feminism. I'm also just interested in how and why we sort of define it today. I think that's something to continually sort of ask so that we know, what's the goal, where are we going, how, what's the significance of feminism today. Also just interested in sort of the popular image of feminism versus sort of actuality, if that makes sense. So how do we think about feminism as this big image but when really it's a lot of people doing a lot of things and what gets sort of left out, we think about what's actually happening on the ground. Another piece of big question for me is how does the feminism relate to other social movements, other marginalized identities? I think even if you think about right now, how, what is the connection relationship between feminism and Black Lives Matter? How do we think through that? How can we ask great questions of feminism that get at the connections between these other kinds of movements that are going on? Same for how do we make sense of trans and intersex communities within feminism? And I think we've seen a lot of tensions play out with that, even if you're just looking at, conversations develop on Twitter about those things and being sort of exclusive, some people being exclusive in their approach to feminism. I'm also really interested in just what does gender inequality look like today? I think there's a lot of things how we think about gender is changing in our society, but we have all of these differing situations and environments where inequality still exists, and we have, the need for changes in policy, the changes in just how we think about things to see and draw attention to those things. And so for me, one of the conversations that I've been most interested in the last couple of years is what's going on with the Olympics and higher level athletics with testosterone bans on athletes. If they have athletes who identify as women who have too high of testosterone level banned from competing. And so I think it's a really interesting thing that's going on that raises important questions for feminism. And that kind of leads me to my last point that I'll make before I close it out here. What does for today change actually look like? And how do we measure it? And what does it look like? What should it look like? I think that's a big question to wrestle with as well. So that's my little take. I will stop sharing my screen now, hand it back over to y'all.
Thank you so much. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Sandra Godwin. And she's a member of the Department of Government and Sociology and teaches courses in gender and social psychology and food and agriculture. She's actually my personal sociological perspectives professor. And she's taught at Georgia College since 2002 and is currently teaching a new course with Dr. Erin Viscara called Feminist Methods. So I will go ahead and let you have the floor, Dr. Godwin.
Thank you so much, Lily. I recognized you, and thank you for that introduction. When I got the invitation to speak for the panel today, I was excited to share a panel with Lauren and Sabrina, and also because I know of the history of these events and I have attended them. They're always well organized, well attended, and I was happy to be a part of it. So thank you all for the invitation. The two prompts that I decided to respond to are, I think, the same ones that Lauren chose, and that's a little bit about my personal story of feminism, and then how my perception of feminism has changed throughout my life. So I'm organizing the first response around 3 women who influenced my life as a feminist. And the first woman is my late mother, who passed away in 2014, but she's still teaching me how to stand up for myself. And I consider that to be a feminist issue. I consider that to be a lifelong journey of mine that I will continue to struggle with. And one of the ways she taught me that was she stood up to the men who ruled her church, which was very, very important to her. It was the same church that I grew up in. It was a church called, the church is the Church of Christ. And so she stood her ground, and it was women had no decision-making power in the church unless they were deciding what food to prepare for for various events, or who would clean the church. So that was about the extent of the power that she had, but she just took, she made a place for herself. So I'm still learning from her, standing up for myself. And I'll give you an image of her. It was a piece of jewelry that she wore during this time frame where she was struggling in her marriage with my father. And for my whole life, their marriage was a struggle. But so she stood up to him as well as to the men in her church. And so she wore a piece of jewelry at one phase of her life where she was learning herself how to stand up. And it was just on a gold chain. It was a medallion, and it was engraved with the words, "I'm me." And then many years later, we talked about how she understood herself as drawing a circle and standing in it, that this was who she was and her space, and she was claiming that. The second woman I wanted to talk to you about who influenced my feminist journey is Mary Rogers, who has also passed away. She passed away in 2009, or around that time. She was 64 years old. She was a professor of mine, a sociologist, a feminist at the University of West Florida in Pensacola. And I took her class quite by accident. The course I wanted to teach was wanted to take was full. And so I took her course. I was at the time an English major. I continued to be an English major, but I added sociology after that course. We read a book in the course. It was a social psychology course, and it was called Wayward Puritans by Kai Erikson, whose father is Erik Erikson, who you all probably have heard of him before. But I thought, this book about wayward Puritans or Puritans sounds exactly like the church where I grew up. So the reason, so sociology spoke to me, and it just explained so many things, not necessarily feminism in that particular book, but sociology and feminism speaking to me in a way that explained my life experience, and in a way I'd never had heard of anything before that gave me the tools to do that. And so after that course, Mary also asked me to be a part of a research group with 2 other students, and we did a content analysis of letters to the editor of the New York Times. And so that also influenced me. And in the theory course that I took with Mary, we read a book called Reflections on Gender and Science by Evelyn Foxkeller, who is a biologist. And that book had such a huge impact on me. And I learned from it that science itself is gendered. And the way we acquire knowledge and produce knowledge as academics really is itself gendered. And so she looks at Francis Bacon and the scientific method, and that book had a huge impact on me. The final person I'll tell you about who had a huge impact on me in terms of feminism and sociology is Helen Lewis. And Helen turns 97 on Saturday. She graduated from Georgia State College for Women, which was Georgia College back in the day. It was segregated at the time. She graduated in 1946. She and I have published a book together, which I'm actually talking about next Wednesday. And but she is someone who really influenced me in terms of research, but also teaching. And she worked for years in Appalachian communities with women and rural community development. And her approach to research was participatory and collaborative, much like feminists have critiqued positivism, which is something that kind of fits into Evelyn Foxkeller's work that had been introduced to in Mary's class. But two things that I learned one thing I learned from Helen and Mary is that it's really important to have a good time. And when we talk about oppression and we learn about all these things that are depressing, it's really important to have a good time. And so that's one of the things that I learned from both of them. But that's a little bit about my personal story in terms of feminism. And then finally, I wanted to say a bit about how my thoughts or how my perception of feminism has changed through the years. And I would say that I think my perspective on feminism is broadening and opening up, like Lauren is talking about it being fluid for everybody. I think it's fluid as you age, it's fluid, but just as a principle of the thing, it should be inclusive. So I feel myself moving in a more inclusive direction. And what I mean by that is being influenced by the transgender movement. And when I was in grad school, we did not read about transgender identity. The closest we got to it, and so I was in grad school in the mid 90s to late 90s. So when the closest we got to it was Sandra Godwin. She's a psychologist who wrote about this androgyny. So that's about as close as we got. On one end is femininity, on the other end is masculinity, and so in the middle is androgyny. So we critique the gender binary in other ways, but I have come to, I still feel myself moving, and going in new directions. And I'll tell you this is related to, I think, the transgender movement, but I don't know if any of you have seen the show on Netflix called Pose. And I will have to say it has really influenced me and impacted me. I have thoroughly enjoyed the program, and I'll tell you the piece that I'm still struggling with is it's sort of what some sociologists call exaggerated femininity and hegemonic masculinity, which you've probably heard of those terms. So that kind of continuum. But what I'm learning to do is open and be more appreciative of exaggerated femininity. For example, on the show, it's about the ballroom subculture, and I'm sure people know what that is, but just in case there's someone who doesn't, the show focuses on the ballroom subculture. There are, it has to do with, and they have episodes devoted to Madonna and the song Vogue, and all of the, how she appropriated, I think some would say appropriated that term. or the subculture herself, and there are pieces of that are in the show. But for me, the big thing was what I'm coming to is understanding how my version, my critique of femininity is one thing, and it doesn't necessarily mean that exaggerated femininity is equivalent to submission to cisgender heterosexual men, which has been my experience with femininity. So I think, and my critique of it, and so I feel like that the trans women on the show are women who have been excluded from that expression of femininity that they have wanted, and that is where some of their experience comes from that I need to be aware of and appreciate, and I am learning to do that in ways that I have not before. So that's a little bit about my journey and some of the people who've affected me along the way, and I'll turn it over now to the next person.
Thank you, Dr. Godwin. I'd now like to I'd now like to introduce Dr. Hom. She's a member of the Department of Philosophy, Religion, and Liberal Studies. She earned her BA at Wellesley College and an MA and PH in philosophy at Stony Brook University. She also completed an advanced graduate certificate at Women's Studies at Stony Brook, and she's a co-founder of the Luce Irigaray Circle. I hope I said that right. Prior to her time at Georgia College, Dr. Hom taught at McGill University and Westminster College at Salt Lake City. She's originally from New York City, and her areas of research include feminist philosophy, contemporary continental philosophy, critical mixed race theory, and Asian American philosophy. So, Dr. Hom, if you could go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Like Lauren and Sandra, I responded to the same prompts. So, much like Sandra, I'll be talking about some people who have been very important in my life. I don't have a big dramatic story about becoming a feminist because I was raised to be one, as I'm raising my daughters to be as well. I don't think that means, oh, hi, Salt Lake City, cool. We should chat about that. I don't know that everyone in my family agreed on what feminism would mean. I don't know if my grandma from the old country had the same vision that I did, but I know that she really wanted me to have the opportunities that she didn't have to continue her education and to have a career. So in that sense, I was always raised to be a feminist. And one of the things that means is that the formative experiences for me often have to do with stories and observations that I have from these people that I care about. I remember my mother telling me when I was young and I didn't want to do my homework, she would tell me how hard she had to fight to take science classes when she was in school, because she went to a very small town, very poor school, and they didn't have a lot of seats in the science class. And when she tried to enroll, they told her that they didn't have seats for girls, that she should take home ec instead. So they tried to put her in a home ec class where someone tried to teach her that, she was supposed to be at home wearing heels when her husband came home from work and she should serve him steak, which was really alienating in multiple ways because both from a gender perspective and because her family never ate steak. I mean, it was also really class inappropriate. That was really an imposition of a extremely strict, this is the 1950s and 60s, right, vision of middle-class womanhood. And she had to fight against that. She would not have had her job. She wouldn't have had her whole career. She was a researcher. She never would have been able to have that if she hadn't been able to fight to take those classes. And, the things that I took for granted and complained about, she really wanted me to know what a fight that had been. Another part of the prompt had to do with why feminism is so important for all genders. That is also something I observed in my home from a young age. I remember my father being laid off from his job, and his, he is a feminist. He cares a lot about equality and opportunity and cared about that for me, but he was not very critical about masculinity and about his role. So his vision of himself was that he as a man, he was not a, hands-on dad changing diapers. His vision was that he needed to be the breadwinner for the family. And when he got laid off, it was really devastating. I remember he spent months, he would put on his work uniform and pack his lunch and go to the park. And he sat on a park bench and read the New York Times from cover to cover every day because he didn't want any of the neighbors to know he was out of work. It was profoundly humiliating for him, to the extent that one day he came home with very severe sunburn because he'd lost track, and it was more important for him to maintain that veneer of masculinity, right? That he was a good man. He didn't want people to know. He was so ashamed, right? That was more important for him than his health. And so it really showed me how important it is for everyone to be critical about these strictures and limitations, and how harmful they are to women and to men and to non-binary people. I wasn't thinking about non-binary people, to be honest with you, when I was 8, but of course that's true as well. As I grew up and saw beyond the horizons of my natal family, the kinds of stories and experiences I heard only kind of deepened my understanding. My best friend's mother was a very brave and generous woman who shared some of her stories with us when we were pretty young. She had her daughter, my best friend, when she was 18 years old. She was very anti-abortion. To her, although she was young, although she had to drop out of school, that was the thing that she felt was right to do. And she never regretted it. But a few years later, she got pregnant again, and she was alone. And she felt that she had to have an abortion because otherwise she wouldn't be able to take care of her daughter. And she was brave enough to share that with the young women in her family and in her orbit, because she felt that it was important for us to understand the kinds of decisions that women make. And also to feel, that we weren't alone, because so many women make those decisions in our lives, right? I also had a very close friend of mine in school was from Romania. And in Romania at the time, when she had immigrated, really fled as a refugee, it was an authoritarian government. And one of the things this authoritarian government did was completely ban birth control and abortion. And she had a very up close view of how that affected women in her family, because what that meant is that women became pregnant. They really didn't have the ability to avoid that. And they had what we call in America back alley abortions. What that meant for her and her class and in her circle in Romania was that a person with some degree of medical skill, hopefully a high degree, but you couldn't be sure, came to your house and performed this procedure, usually on the coffee table, because it was about the right height and size. So this was a thing that happened in her home. They had to pray and worry about the survival of her cousins who had to undergo this. Sometimes had very scary experiences where there was bleeding and you couldn't go to the doctor. And these were very vivid. This was again part of her life as a child. Obviously, it made a huge impression on her, and then on me hearing these stories. For her, one of the things it meant to come to the United States and to have freedom. Well, that freedom from being subjected to a dangerous back alley abortion under humiliating and frightening circumstances, that's what America meant to her. And those are the kinds of stories that I carry with me now, as of course, reproductive rights and abortion rights are still challenged and very much under attack in many parts of the United States. So those are some of my formative experiences, are actually hearing these stories. And I also think that's an important reminder that when we tell our stories and when we share them, there's a kind of sacred trust to that. I mean, when people open up to us, I think that sometimes we're sort of obliged to carry the wisdom and the depth of what they're sharing with us. But it really can be transformative. And I've been very privileged to be the recipient of that kind of openness in many instances. I would also say that my experience of feminism has always been wrapped up in my thoughts and experience of race as well. I am mixed race. My parents are an interracial couple who got married, I believe 6 years after Loving versus Virginia, which is the Supreme Court case which legalized interracial marriage throughout the United States. That is something that, always shaped our family and the choices we were making. My parents had to be very careful in choosing where they were going to live. They actually toured the whole country, trying to figure out where they would be safe. They took a road trip and didn't feel safe in a lot of the places that they stopped at that time. The kinds of reactions and questions and calculations that we faced as an interracial family also were shaping my understanding. And it was very clear to me, right, because this is an interracial family, interracial relationships where the man is non-white tend to be even more controversial and get even more kind of negative reactions. So it was very clear to me from the beginning that the kinds of racism that they were facing was also wrapped up with concerns about controlling women's sexuality and controlling women's reproduction, particularly controlling, white women's reproduction, like my mother's, and with other kinds of ideals about gender and reproduction and what a country is supposed to look like. And I think that's influenced me in the sense that I do very much try to approach feminism from an intersectional perspective. And of course, if you keep listening to the stories of people who are not like you, you get a bigger and bigger tent. That's certainly been the evolution of my feminism, is the more people you care about and the more people you open up to, the more you realize what their interests are and that those interests need to be taken into consideration. I would say at this point, I see feminism as a very broad-based social justice movement and as one that cannot be distinguished from class-based issues of justice, from racial justice, from disability rights, et cetera. I don't know, I think I may have taken up my time. I can stop there and maybe we can take some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hom. Yeah, we are going to open it up for questions. You guys can go ahead in the chat and ask some, and we'll call it out and we'll just treat it like a panel, and we'll have each of our speakers go through and answer. So I'm going to give like a few seconds if there's questions. Yeah. In the meantime, while people are thinking, I'll ask a question. What is something in your life right now that is like either in the media or just like prevalent in your life right now that's inspiring you with your like drive for feminism? I'll also type that down so that you can read it too.
It's a really interesting question. I don't have a well-formed answer to it, but I guess I'll take a shot. I am a parent, and I've been thinking a lot about parenting issues, caregiving issues. Obviously, my children have caregivers, and I think a lot about the conditions that they live under and how much they're paid and their working conditions. So I've been really inspired by some of the political changes going on right now, that in this country, for the first time, families have access to childcare, to payments to help support them. This started out as a pandemic initiative. I don't know if it will continue. I think that it should. It is something that most developed countries do, to provide some floor, some basic income for people who are doing this crucial work of caregiving. So I'm very excited that that's happening. We're at this point in our country starting to have real conversations about things like paid parental leave, real conversations about universal childcare, and how to support parents. And I think that's so crucial. It's a crucial issue of gender justice. It's crucial to alleviate child poverty, which is really widespread. And it's also a reproductive rights issue, right? I am a pro-choice person, and I don't think that we can say that people who are pregnant really have a choice if they're facing terrible economic deprivation in the course of becoming a parent, if they really aren't sure that they'll be able to support their child or care for their child. So, to me, that is a very hopeful trend that I'm quite excited about.
I'll jump in here. For me, something recently in media or stuff that we're thinking about in terms of feminism, this kind of goes back to what I'm talking about sports, as I did in my presentation or my 2 slides. The Olympics over the summer I got really into, and I thought it was interesting. Just the number of women that competed, and then the medal count. Women had way more medals than men in the U.S. for the U.S. But it was interesting to see these representations of some of these really decorated Olympians that have had kids recently. Allison Felix is one I'm thinking of, and that being a huge thing that was pointed out in a lot of the coverage, like, oh, she's a mom doing this, and the complexity of that, and that it's great that they acknowledge that. But at the same time, they're not doing that for, the men athletes and what that's sort of suggesting. So there's that piece. And then kind of like I mentioned in my presentation as well, there's also under the radar that was not covered by the media, these 6 or so women, I believe, women of color, who are banned because of their top testosterone levels, just outright, which seems a move that they're trying to make to limit trans athletes from competing. And so there's a lot of layers to that. I think, I don't know, that the Olympics as an event, it just exposed some different ways that we're thinking about gender and some like images of it, and like how we've sort of progressed as a society, or think that we progressed, but other things that we're still dealing with that need to be addressed. So yeah, that stood out to me recently.
I'll just jump in there and say quickly that all the young women who are at the forefront of the movement of climate change awareness, and Greta Thunberg and her, she has a friend who is from Uganda, and they are really very much in the spotlight. Probably, I've heard more probably from Greta about her, but I am thoroughly inspired by these young women.
Okay, thank you. We actually got some questions in the chat. So thank you, Kaden and Shiloh. I'm going to start with Kaden's question to put that out for y'all. So what is something that you think gets misinterpreted when talking about feminism in the United States? So I guess.
To answer your question, we've talked about it a lot in our class, actually. I think something that gets misinterpreted is that feminists are totally like extreme, and all they want is more power than men and this and that. And I feel like that's what a lot of people think when they first hear the word feminist or feminism. And that may be the case for some, but I really think that with a lot of the movements, the main focus is total equality for everyone. Not just men and women, every gender, sex, whatever. Like, I think that's what a main misinterpretation is. That's what I would say. If anybody wants to add on to that, or.
I think that's a great answer. And I think that a related misconception is that feminism is somehow anti-male or putting men down. I really think it's the opposite. Sometimes I listen to the way that people who are explicitly non-feminists talk about men, and you'd think that these are some kind of lower life form that could never learn how to change a diaper or to control their sexual urges, right? It's if it were not so influential, and it would be just absurd, right? To pass that off as somehow pro-male discourse, when really it's about justifying holding people to sort of preposterously low standards, and low standards that actually exclude them from a lot of the things that are valuable in life, like caregiving and respectful and consensual relationships with other human beings. So yeah, I think that's a huge misconception.
To jump in on that too, yeah, I think just the misconception that like feminism and like gender issues are really about women and femininity, like, is a huge misconception. And this goes back to Sabrina's point and when she was talking earlier about yeah, masculinity, like being a part of that too, if that makes sense. So I think they're not just issues that belong to sort of one group. These are it's all genders involved and sort of that. So I think freeing it up from being like, oh, this is an issue I don't have to deal with if I'm not in that set group, if that makes sense. I also would add to, I think there's like a misconception that like, our current like social media like environment and younger people being aware of feminism, I think gets a bad rep for being, I think youth that are doing cool things, it gets downplayed as just being like young people on social media. That's not really doing anything. And I think that's a mischaracter. I don't think that's an accurate characterization of what young people are doing, particularly with feminism. I think that floats around out there like, oh, it's just image, it's not actuality, and that kind of thing. So
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that other than to say that I do think those are common, what y'all have been talking about. Sabrina, and Lauren in the beginning before you got to the social media point, is that I see that a lot in my classes, that not so much that well, I do, students do come in with that perception, but I think they, in my gender and society class, of course, they will know that that is a misconception, but I think it's still, yeah, it's still around.
Awesome. Thank you guys. I love those responses. I really find the whole generational aspect of that very interesting, and it plays into a lot of the, I guess, lack of continuity in these waves of feminism that we're experiencing. But to kind of shift it just a little bit, so Shiloh said, what are some feminist issues you are concerned with outside of the US?
this is not necessarily an issue per se, but it kind of has to do with what you just mentioned about continuity and thinking about generational continuity. I think thinking about continuity across national borders is absolutely something that like needs to be more engaged with. And I feel like I have, even in my own educational background with feminism, have gaps and blind spots from just not having that be sort of there being a global perspective on that, and understanding feminist movements and how they differ in different national contexts, if that makes sense, and how there's nuance in what is an issue in one country. That issue can look drastically different in another country, and not having some sort of hierarchical assumption of that ties into the ideas that some countries are more developed and more advanced than others. And that's really what it comes down to. I think all of those need to be sort of questions. And we just at the level of like what we read and engage with in classes needs to be more global in perspective so that we can have that continuity, if that makes sense.
That's a great response. I think I'm thinking along similar lines. When I think about the issues that are facing women in other parts of the world, I'm often thinking about the ways in which the United States is complicit in those. A very wise friend of mine from India once told me I was very worried about something that was happening in American politics. And he said, well, the worst of it always gets exported, right? The worst, that's not to say that there won't be bad effects within the United States, but that the worst and the harshest would be exported. And I've come to believe that is very true. Of course, I think many of us are heartbroken and extremely concerned about the situation in Afghanistan for women and for many people in Afghanistan. And I'm also aware that, this 20-year-long war, this colonial exertion, misadventure of our country has done a lot to undermine the Afghan women's movement and to co-opt the Afghan women's movement and really to make the job of Afghan feminists a lot harder and to force a lot of people into exile as a result of that. When the anti-LGBT laws and movements and violence in sub-Saharan Africa often is being fueled by churches that are coming from the United States and sharing a very extreme anti-LGBT viewpoint. The really terrible violence in Central America that is sending so many refugees and asylum seekers toward our border is fueled in part by our drug war and fought with guns that are smuggled across the border from the United States. So I am convinced these are some of the issues that I'm concerned about, and I would say, and I think I'm echoing Lauren here, that I don't think it is the role of American feminists to fix things for other people in other parts of the world and to fly in as saviors and try to make some kind of cultural change. I think what we really need to do is to be very alert and clear-eyed and critical about the ways that our actions affect people in other parts of the world and often makes it harder for them to engage in their own path of liberation and creating for themselves the world that they want to see, not our vision, right, but their vision, which is suitable to them. I guess that when I think about those issues, it very often ends up coming home to American action and policy.
I'll just say that I share the same. Well, Lauren mentioned the gaps she sees in her own education for global feminisms, and I would say yes, I definitely have that as well. There is one movement I am inspired by. This is a peasant farmer group called Via Campesina, and they're a huge organization, and it's led by women, and they focus on all kinds of issues, including climate change and corporate, agribusiness from the global north and their extraction of resources from the global south, and very, focused on capitalist agriculture. And this is just, I have found a wonderful organization. They also address issues of sexual harassment in the agricultural industry. For example, farm workers in the field, women who are assaulted sometimes by their co-workers. But so that's just something I wanted to mention. That is a movement that I'm really excited about and do keep track of what they're doing, and they're very overtly feminist, and it's something that I enjoy following that group.
So it looks like we just have like one last question on the chat, and then I'm going to go ahead and close that out because we're going to wrap it up here in just a second. But if y'all want to quickly give your perspective on Joanna's question, which has to do with the Texas kind of going towards Roe versus Wade, and SCOTUS doesn't seem to hold precedent in as high regard as it did previously. How can that mobilize for change here to protect women's rights?
Well, I do think it's happening. I mean, there are marches planned throughout I think the country this weekend, right? Is that a national event? Yeah, I hope people will mobilize and will mobilize in time. You know, a lot of women, especially women of color and women who don't have the economic resources to go out of state, are already suffering in a very serious way from this. In other instances, and I'm thinking of the recent referendum in Ireland that legalized abortion in that country. It was set off because a woman died, and a woman of color who was an immigrant to Ireland died. Oh, thanks for the link, Stephanie. I think it would be, I don't know if our country's in the place to make this happen, but it would be a very good thing if the real mobilization happened before women had to die. But you know, when people start to die of back alley abortions, then probably that would mobilize.
Let me just jump in here and say I agree with Sabrina, and I think, like a lot of things going on, it is, maybe we're depressed about it, but it can mobilize us. And I also wanted to apologize to Lauren, who I just misgendered, and I apologize, Lauren. Please accept my apology. But sometimes I think these things, you know, like you're talking about with the Texas issue and the Supreme Court, that is, as much as we're, you know, disturbed by what's happening, it can absolutely push us, you know, to stand up in ways that we may not have otherwise done.
I will jump in as well. I don't have an answer, a solution to that. Any and all strategies to mobilize against something like that. And I'll just, same things that have sort of been said. And I think that kind of comes back around to all of these things that we've been sort of talking about, small and large, like they are political. So I think remembering that it is really sort of important when it comes down to just the day to day and obviously voting and just keeping that in mind. Elections matter. So any and all strategies and remembering that this stuff it's political and it affects people like day to day in their actual lives. And while I think Sandra said earlier about like having fun, like, you know, taking care of yourself to do that work, of course, but remembering and coming back to the importance of that work as well. And being creative in that and coming up with exploring with that, if that makes sense too, so that we can just evolve.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up our event. I just want to take a minute and say thank you to everyone for attending. And we really appreciate the Women's Center for helping us so much with this. And it was a great experience getting to partner with them. Also, we would like to thank our amazing speakers. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules to come and teach this event. And I think that's everything. So you guys are free to go.